Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to Recall This Book, where we invite scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. So let's begin with this scientific observation. As dogs, cats, horses, and probably all the higher animals, even birds, have vivid dreams, we must admit that they possess some power of imagination. So that, courtesy of the book we're going to discuss today, is from Charles Darwin's 1872, The Descent of Man. And Darwin's evolutionary theories famously established a corporeal commonality between animal species, but there's also a trickier legacy of hard questions about commonalities of consciousness. If other animals dream like us and imagine like us, what else can we infer or suspect or demonstrate about their consciousness? Does the world matter to them in some of the same ways it matters to us? And if so, how should that kind of mattering then in turn matter to us humans? So, hello, I'm John Plotz of Brandeis University, a scholar of science fiction, but no scientist. But today, in the same spirit as our episode 65 conversation with Peter Godfrey Smith about octopus consciousness, that was during Octopus Month, October 2021, I'm speaking with David Peña-Guzmán, author of a fantastic new book, When Animals Dream, The Hidden World of Animal Consciousness, Princeton 2022. David, hi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here. I'm looking forward to it.
It's a great pleasure. So let me just quickly tell listeners that David's PhD is in philosophy, and he's associate professor of humanities at San Francisco State University. He is the co-author of an earlier book called Chimpanzee Rights, The Philosopher's Brief, and he's also co-host of the wonderfully titled philosophy podcast, Overthink. So, David, I've got so much to say about this book with its beautiful octopus on the cover and its incredible forays into different ways of thinking about animal consciousness. But we tend to like to start things off and Recall This Book, whether I'm joined by my co-host Elizabeth Ferry or not, but in this case not. We tend to hand things off to the guest and invite them to introduce their work, to frame its key ideas or its interventions, or it maybe even in this case, you could point towards what you think has been controversial or influential in the reception of your work. So basically just an invitation to open the field by letting us know what the book is about and what you care about most within it.
Thank you. Yes, I think the quote from Darwin that you began with is a great way of contextualizing and historicizing the book that I wrote, because I do see myself as working in the heels of this way of thinking that we inherit from the 19th century, and to which in some ways I believe that we need to return, which is a way of thinking about nature that foregrounds animals as complete subjects. That is to say, as agents who have a lot of similarities with human beings, but also a lot of differences. So, for example, in the book that you mentioned from 1872, The Descent of Man, Darwin introduces his Victorian readers to a whole spectrum of emotions, concepts, inferential capacities that we thought we were the only ones to possess in the entire world. But he tells us that, in fact, many other non-human animals also experience anger, jealousy, joy. They have the capacity to differentiate between same and different, between friend and foe. And they also are able to make rational inferences that suggest a certain kind of rationality at work in their minds. And so my work here tries to continue this way of thinking about, let's say, the subjectivity of non-human animals by taking a very specific capacity as its focus, and that is the capacity to dream. And so I use dreaming, which is a fascinating thing that brains and nervous systems and organisms do, as a window into the minds of a lot of other animals that share this capacity with us. And so the book is, let's say, a post or neo-Darwinian exploration of animal consciousness that really tries to present animals using a term from the book as world builders. And what I mean by that is that animals are world builders, not in the strict ecological sense that they literally build nests or that they leave their mark in physical space, but also in this deeper philosophical sense, which is that they build their own world of experience out of their cognitive, emotional, social, and sensory capacities. And so if you bring together that Darwinian reference with that reminder that you just gave your listeners that I myself was trained as a philosopher, that gives you a sense of the kind of book that this is. It is a philosophical interpretation of biological subjectivity.
Yeah, that's so great that you picked up on the Darwin connection. And as you said that, I was thinking about the wonderful discussion in that book of the commonality. I think he has a discussion about snarling in dogs, and he points out that humans also snarl in some of the same ways dogs do. And that maybe leads me to one thread that we could pick up right now. I mean, there's so many other topics you've opened up here, including why one would need to go back to the 19th century to recover that investment in animal subjectivity. But setting aside the sort of century detour that maybe is being that you are kind of coming, or that you were the roadblock that you have gone around now. Can I pick up on two different ways that you characterized the importance of what dreaming shows? One was about basically sensory or subjective commonality, the notion that the feeling and experiencing that humans have might be echoed or is echoed in the feeling and experience that animals have. But the other was the point about thinking rationally. Those seem that we can see proof of animal rationality. Those are distinct points, and one could potentially see them heading in different directions, right? One emphasizing sensibility as the crucial connection, and the other emphasizing cognition, like the proof that cognition that we think of as unique to humans actually occurs in other animals. Do you want to say something about like those two different aspects of the argument you're making?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good place to begin, actually, because these two terms, sensibility and rationality, capture different traditions in the history of philosophy for thinking the animal, the non-human animal. There is a tradition that foregrounds the operation of the body, that corporeality that we also find referenced in Darwin's works. And there's another tradition of thinking about the animal that foregrounds questions of rationality, concept manipulation, linguistic capacities. And the thing about these two strands of thinking about the difference between human and non-human animals is that they actually lead to very different conclusions depending on how they get cashed out. And in particular, one of my worries as a philosopher who is interested in how we think about nature, one of my worries is that when we put too much weight or too much value on things precisely like rationality, like language, like human style morality, and make those preconditions for either having sentience or consciousness or moral value, we end up producing a lot of what are known as false negatives. And that is to say that we draw the false and erroneous conclusion that a lot of other species, from insects to cephalopods all the way to other mammals, simply don't have that rich inner world that we know we have through introspection, through first-person experience. And so what I try to do in my book is I lean toward the first path of these two. I lean towards the sensibility, the embodiment, the affect, the emotion side of experience, because I think that's where the real value actually of animal life lies, rather than in these high-end, high-order cognitive capacities. But you're right that in the book, I do also talk about those cognitive dimensions of human and non-human life in connection to dreaming. But I certainly have a philosophical commitment to the claim that what makes us humans and other animals matter from a moral point of view is not the possession of reason or language or conceptuality, but rather our capacity to feel the world on an affective, corporeal, and embodied level. And I take that framework and use it to also interpret the experience of dreaming in other animals, which I see fundamentally as subjective and affective, more so than rational and logical. And in fact, what we know about dreams is that the one thing we can agree upon about dreams is that they are highly illogical at times. And yet, and this is the important part, and yet they teach us something about how the minds of other animals operate and give us this window into their subjectivity.
So, can you say a little bit more about the notion of dreaming as world building and why you feel certain that, or why you feel confident that that's something that's going on in animal dreaming as well?
Yeah, and for the listeners who have not yet read the book, let me just note that the book is written, let's say, like a logical edifice, in the sense that I begin by presenting the evidence, the scientific evidence that we have for just believing that dreaming is not an exclusively human capacity. So I cite a lot of research from animal sleep, indicating that many other animals also experience these nightly visions that we call dreaming, that when they go to sleep, there is this spike in mental and corporeal activity that suggests that there is a whole world that is imagined, that is projected, and that is, using maybe a metaphor here from magic, conjured up, almost like a witch conjuring up a spell by the animal who is asleep. And it's something that we do. It's something that many other mammals do. And it's something that plenty of non-mammals do. That includes birds, fish. I talk quite a bit about octopuses, for example, and other cephalopods like cuttlefish. And so it's a capacity that is quite widespread throughout the animal kingdom. So the book begins by laying out this evidence and then teasing out the philosophical implications of this claim. So once we know that other animals dream, what exactly does that mean? What does it tell us about their capacity for memory, about their capacity for subjective experience? What does it teach us about their ability to imagine things that are not real? And so it starts opening up into all these avenues that, for me as a philosopher, are utterly fascinating. I lost myself in many of these. And one of those avenues is this notion of world building. Now, we know from the history of philosophy and from the history of science, especially neuroscience, that the world that we experience when we are in the waking state certainly has a very close connection to objective reality. We react, we perceive things that are beyond us, that are outside of our mind, that are mind independent. But we also know that the nature of our experience of those things is colored by the activity of the mind. It is the things that the mind creates, that the mind constructs, that ultimately become the stuff of our lived experience.
Like, as you were talking, I was, of course, thinking, anyone who's, I don't even own a dog, but I've lived with dogs enough to see what happens when dogs dream. But you have wonderful examples of, for example, chimpanzees who seem to be signing, like sign language that they know how to use in wake. They seem to be using those same signs while they're sleeping. But you have a whole series of pieces of evidence, including, I think, and this is maybe a wrinkle that I don't know if you want to go there or not, but you're not only are you interested in you're interested in the ways in which human beings, we've also been able to study humans while sleeping, kind of extrinsically, not just recording our own dreams, but looking at what a human brain looks like under sleep. So maybe could you talk us through some of the evidence that makes you feel pretty confident about the deep commonality between animal dream experience and human dream experience?
Yeah, well, let me begin answering that question by noting the main difficulty that I faced writing this book, and that is obvious, which is that typically when we want to know if somebody, our neighbors, our family members, our loved ones, dream, we simply ask them and we get a dream report. But that is not available to us in the case of non-human animals, given that we don't share a linguistic schema. And so in trying to figure out whether or not other animals do or don't experience these inner mental states that we call dreaming, we have no choice but to rely on those extrinsic markers. And those markers are of two different orders. There are markers tied to do that have to do with what you have just referenced, which are oniric behaviors. The term oniric is the adjectival form of the ancient Greek root oneiros, which means dreaming. So oniric behaviors is just a way of saying dream-related or dream-indicating behaviors. So what does that include? It includes things like moving our bodies in particular way when we're asleep in ways that seem to match what our dream body is doing in the dream world. It also includes facial gestures. It includes vocalizations. So think about everything that the body does, especially during moments of REM sleep, which is the phase of sleep most traditionally associated with dreaming, that can be signs of what's happening phenomenologically in the dream. So that's one kind of evidence. And this is where I talk about, for instance, that research from primatology that suggests that chimpanzees that have been trained to speak using ASL, American Sign Language, they will sign in their sleep during REM, suggesting that they're having entire conversations with some interlocutor in their dreams. You know, we don't really know who those interlocutors are. We may never know what the layout of their dream world exactly is, but we do get this insight into the fact that their dreams most likely include communicative and therefore symbolic content, that they are saying things, they are talking. I also talk about the behavior of octopuses, who are obviously not using ASL, but who communicate in other ways, especially through their chromatophoric system. So we know that octopuses make all kinds of displays to indicate particular emotional states, particular affective states, to indicate, for example, when they recognize a friend versus a foe. And when we find those same chromatophoric displays suddenly emerging in the context of sleep, again, it's another piece in that pyramid of evidence that I try to build in the book to suggest that, yes, there is something real, internal, and dreamlike happening here. And so one side of the evidence has to do with all these oniric behaviors. But the other side has to do with those signatures of neural activity that you mentioned, patterns of neuronal activation that, again, allow us to establish certain parallels, very important parallels, between the waking state and the dreaming state. So, for example, we know that when animals perform certain behaviors that are highly significant and important for them, for their social and their cultural lives, some of those behaviors are correlated with a very specific neural signature. So every time you see that behavior, you will find that neural signature associated with it. When you then see that exact same neural signature emerging in the context of sleep, again, you have now an entirely different but similarly persuasive piece of evidence to believe that, okay, maybe these animals are having an experience, and you see that reflected in the way their brains are operating. So I talk about research with birds where the neural signature for certain songs reappear in their sleep, suggesting that they're dreaming of practicing their own song. I talk about this in connection to rats, where we see.
Can I just say, apropos of that, David, I really love that you quoted John Dryden on that. You have a
Yes.
Dryden line from 1665, maybe. The little birds in dreams, their songs repeat. It's maybe another example of a topic that I hope we come back to, which is like this notion of historical recurrence, of these are truths that we already knew about animals, but for some reason didn't want to face up to.
I think if you look at the history of writings on animals, you'll see that a lot of ideas about what animals can do, about how animals behave, about what they feel, have been rejected at various moments based on the configuration of scientific knowledge at that time. But as the configuration of knowledge changes, suddenly we can look at all things through new eyes. And this is the case, at least in this particular reference, which I was very happy to find, about the fact that birds dream their songs. They don't just sing them when they're awake.
Right. So I hear you offering a very multi-causal and also sort of like a multimodal account of way things come and go. But at one point, you also sort of fine that down to an account of the silent century. Like you talk about the period of the 1870s and 1880s. I think there's a book called The Mental Evolution in Animals from 1883, which you suggest is, pointing towards a more capacious way of thinking about animal consciousness. And then you say there's a sort of silent century that follows that. Do you have this may be something that you can't put into a soundbite, but do you have a quick account of like what's changed recently from that, to let that the silence of that century be opened up a little bit, to let those voices back in?
Yeah, so I do tell this story of, let's say, a loud 19th century from the standpoint of natural history, where a lot of naturalists are expressing wonder at the beauty of nature and at the wonderful capacities of other animals, the fact that they lead these rich, interesting lives. And I argue that at the start of the 20th century, there is a shift, especially in psychology, that causes a lot of people interested in animals to turn away from that curiosity that was normal in the 19th century about the inner lives of animals, about their beliefs, about their mental states, about their desires, and to focus exclusively on what could be quantified and what could be observed externally and confirmed by multiple subjects, by multiple scientists. And so there is this shift towards what is known as behaviorism, which basically says, look, we don't really know what's going on in the minds of animals. We can't even say that they have a mind. So let's just bracket all of that and exclusively focus on what they do. So you cannot say that an animal imagines something unless you can somehow correlate that to external behavioral indices. And so I think that had a flattening and impoverishing effect on the natural sciences, because it really took away our capacity to think of animals as agents, as subjects.
Do you have an overarching account of why it would be in the 70s and 80s that behaviorism would wane? Or do you...
I talk about what is known as the cognitive revolution in psychology that occurred it started really in the 50s. Then the consequences were really felt in the 70s, I would say. And this was the recognition on the part of psychologists themselves that you cannot talk about certain things unless you posit the existence of mental states and unless you start becoming curious about mental processes, about mental mechanisms, and just about how it is that the mind as an apparatus functions. Right. And although we, of course, recognize that there is a highly complex, beautifully complex relationship between mind and body, you lose that beauty if you cut out either element. Right. Yeah. So we have already rejected the idea that we are disembodied minds in the Cartesian sense. But for a minute there, we were tempted and we got lulled by the opposite, or by the inverse notion, which is that we are bodies without minds. And eventually it was psychologists on their own terms who realized that they wanted their field to have more to say about its subject than behaviorism could offer.
Yeah, it will be completely. So as a scholar of science fiction, I'll just say selfishly, like what you say aligns with some of my interest in the rise of what's called new wave science fiction, which is sometimes called inner space science fiction. So that there's a moment in which new wave, with writers like, J.G. Ballard or Philip K. Dick or Ursula Le Guin, that part of the turn is a turn about, focusing on epistemological problems of awareness of basically the alienness of human existence. And so that's fascinating. And then I just also think it's fascinating how that relates to our coming era of AI and what it will, you discuss some of the problems of what it would mean to think about like zombie intelligence, the notion of highly intelligent beings or actors or algorithms that nonetheless don't have consciousness or experience. So it feels like those questions are going to get articulated differently in the 21st century.
No, I think you're right. And, one of the things that I noticed a couple of years back already when I was going to give talks at academic conferences on animal rights or animal ethics or animal cognition, I started noticing the presence of the AI crowd. And initially I was confused. I wasn't sure why these people were visiting these conferences. And of course, then with the rise of large language models and other cutting edge research in AI, it became clear because where animal studies meets contemporary AI is that they are both trying to push at the limits of our conception of consciousness and sentience, and both have an interest in potentially expanding legal protections in the form of rights to entities that each camp considers good candidates for legal standing. Now, I myself do believe that animals deserve protections for their welfare, for their well-being, and that they deserve moral consideration. My view about AI is slightly different, and that is because I have to admit, so this is me putting my cards on the table, that I am biocentric in my thinking. I don't think AI is the right kind of thing for what we call sentience or consciousness. Of course, AI is exceptional at things like information manipulation, information storage. My computer, in many ways, is a lot smarter than I will ever be. But that's why, as I mentioned at the beginning of our interview, when you think about those two strands in the history of thinking for understanding animal life, the one that foregrounds sensibility, affect, and emotion, and the one that foregrounds intelligence, rationality, and conceptuality, I very much lean on the side of feeling and sentiment rather than information processing and information manipulation. And that also leads me to have this view about AI where I'm suspicious of contemporary the contemporary fetishization and almost deification of Silicon Valley style thinking about machines. So I just don't think they're conscious. I don't think they ever will be conscious in the way that matters for us.
Yeah, if you don't mind, we could turn to your final chapter, The Value of Animal Consciousness, because that's a place where you sort of put some ethical cards on the table, and maybe it would get us to questions about, what I framed at the beginning as like why what matters to animals should matter to us. But you have an interesting claim. I'll just start with a claim that you make about moral status. And you say our moral status comes from our primordial bond with the world, where our sensations, affects, and emotions commingle with one another. Located within experience but outside the reach of cognition, this bond is what remains once we've peeled away the abstractions of reason and the schema of language. It's our moral and existential bedrock. So do you want to just sort of parse that for us and its implications?
In ethical theory, one of the central questions, of course, is who is a subject that matters? To whom does ethics and morality apply? And that question is often articulated through the language of moral status. Who has moral status of all the things that exist in the universe? Now, most of us have, let's say, a folk understanding of where the lines are to be drawn in general terms. For instance, right in front of me at this moment of recording, I have a cup of coffee, I have a pen, and I have a set of keys. Most of us agree without any deliberation, without any argument, that these things are not moral agents. They are not, they don't have rights. They don't matter from a moral point of view. Now, when we talk about our fellow humans, most of us agree that, well, that's a clear yes. I would hope all of us agree on that point, but some people have historically had prejudiced views that exclude certain humans, that exclude women, that exclude racial minorities, people with disabilities from that category.
Yeah. One of the phrases you used, David, is morally considerable, like on page 152. I think that's a lovely phrase. And I don't want to interrupt you here, but the phrase considerable suggests, a certain kind of grayscale. Like there isn't just one way that moral consideration can work. I mean, you could imagine moral consideration for a flea, a dog, and a human as being different, even though they were all considerable. Yeah.
Correct. And so we can think about the phrase morally considerable as referring to who gets to enter into the room and have a seat at the table where we then discuss what needs to happen in order to live in a moral world. And it doesn't mean that we reach the same conclusions about everybody in that room or at that table, because different organisms have different needs, they have different interests, and they are harmed in different ways. So, for example, mammals that are raised by a caretaker, we are deeply harmed by something like maternal separation. But there are animals who are separated from their progenitors from the moment they hatch. And so for them, that's not an issue. And so it's not that different animals will have exactly the same rights, but that they do have to be considered. And then the discussion gets going about what makes sense for that particular animal. And again, there are some cases where it's relatively clear to all of us that these creatures should be in that room and they should be considered. And there are some entities that clearly don't make it. But the gray area really concerns non-human animals. Should all non-human animals have moral rights? Should only some of them have them? Which ones, to what extent? And so what I try to do in this book is lean on dreaming, on the capacity to dream, as, let's say, a key that opens the lock to that room of moral considerability, where I say, look, if you're the kind of entity that has dreams, that can dream, independently of what you dream about, I don't really care about the content, but if you just have the form or the capacity or the function of dreaming, you have the right to go into that room and have your interests be taken into account, because to dream is to be conscious of the world. It is to have consciousness and sentience and sensibility. It is impossible to dream without having those things. That's really the core argument of the central chapters of my book, that it is logically inconceivable that there would be a dreamer that is completely devoid of consciousness. It simply does not work. And so I try to make this link between dreaming, consciousness, and ethics as a way of suggesting that we humans have a moral obligation to reconfigure how we relate to non-human animals, to treat them differently, to respect their interests, and maybe to codify those interests in the form of legal rights. And one way to decide which animals get included is by looking at dreaming.
You make an allusion to factory farming, which I think all of us would know and have strong views about already, but you also mention invasive scientific research. So that's an interesting move, given that it's a book that is responding to and in dialogue with scientific research, which to some extent presumably does depend on the invasive. How do you think about that, the ethical claim around invasive scientific research?
Yeah, so this is the most honest answer I can give you, and that is that I have felt a sense of tragedy around the writing of this book. And I mean tragedy in the sense that I couldn't avoid engaging with scientific research that doesn't meet the conditions of morality that I would want scientific research to meet, in order to make this argument that points in that direction of the ethical and the moral. And so I found myself in a bit of a catch-22 situation where I had to do a little bit of soul searching when writing this book. I did pose the question to myself, and I kept going back and forth about whether I should engage science at all. Because most of the, especially neuroscientific protocols that I mentioned, of course, they require at the very least keeping animals in captivity. In many cases, they require the killing and the dissection, the killing of the animal and the dissection of the brain. And so the question for me became, should I distance myself from the science, or should I engage the science in order to articulate an argument that ultimately tries to put further limits on it? And I decided that it would have been impossible for me to make the argument I needed to make without engaging research on animal sleep. You can't talk about the dreams of animals without really digging into what evidence we have for believing that, given that a lot of people doubt it. A lot of people are skeptical about the inner lives of other animals. And so
can I just say that YouTube by itself gives you a lot of evidence for animal dreaming, but I take your point completely. But if you wanted to go low road, you could find it. You could find it there.
That does exist, and I do mention them in a few footnotes, some YouTube videos. And so the point here being that I ended up making my own decision. I decided to engage the science, but I also do not want to use that as a moral get out of jail free card. I do think that there is a legitimate criticism there to be made of my overall approach, because I do lean on research whose methods are, from my perspective, unethical. And so that was a sort of tragic decision that I had to make, where I felt like it was tragic in the classical sense that either way, you lose something and you compromise a principle. And so this is something that I've experienced in the past, because a lot of my work is in close connection with the sciences, but it's ultimately motivated by ethical and moral concerns. And the way in which I've justified it to myself is to think of my work as enacting a kind of imminent critique of scientific rationality concerning animals, where what I ultimately really want to do is tell scientists that, look, by your own findings, these are creatures that are much more complex than you realize, and that therefore might be entitled to protections even from the things that you have done that lead us to appreciate that complexity.
In your case, you're describing a tragedy because you precisely need to have the evidence of the experiments that you're studying within bounds in order to be able to make the case that they ought to be out of bounds. Can you think, is there a comparable example in the history of philosophy or the history of science of such a sort of tragic dilemma? I mean, I've never really thought about the scientific tragedy. Is that a scientific tragedy? I mean, maybe there's something with the atom bomb that's comparable.
Well, I mean, one tragedy that we can point to in contemporary physics is just the tragedy of observation in quantum mechanics, that as soon as you observe the micro world of contemporary physics, you only observe it after the wave has collapsed, after the collapse of the wave function. So you can't see what's there before observation as much as you would like to. So there is a certain tragic quality or an aura of tragedy to that.
That's not ethical, though.
It is not an ethical one. No, I think that is an epistemological tragedy. But research on children that was conducted during the Third Reich, because we actually, I mean, this sounds horrible and it sounds justificatory, but we learned some things about children through those horrific experiments. Later, researchers struggled with whether they should even cite that data, even if the data,
it's comparable.
Even if that data was already done and the discoveries were already made. And so I think that would be comparable.
Because let's say you can save a life by citing data that allows you to know something about child's physiology or something. So is it okay to save that life if the price is that you're sanctioning a form of, unthinkable knowledge or
Yeah, and I mean, science is rife with moral dilemmas and moral
Yeah.
tragedies of all sorts.
Yeah.
It's just that in this case, the tragedy is moral, but I would say it's also epistemic because and the two
Mhm.
interact because the more we learn about animals, partly through scientific research,
Yeah.
again, the more our moral intuitions collectively shift about what is okay and not okay to do to those animals. So scientific progress seems to be undermining its own methods through this detour, which is the fact that science shapes our collective imagination, and that includes our moral sensibilities, which then get used to regulate science itself.
Yeah.
And so I I end up using science, recognizing that it's a morally compromised and imperfect answer to the dilemma, and
Mhm.
I at least react to it by not calling. I never call for further research on the subject.
Mhm.
I think what we have up until now is more than enough to see animals in this new light.
So, David, that makes a great place to turn to the very final thing we do every time on the podcast, as well as thanking you, of course. But we like to wrap things up with a section we call Recallable Books, where each of us names an older book that those who enjoyed this conversation might enjoy. So, would you like to go first? Or
Yeah, so I'm going to share a book that is older for me, but might be newer for your listeners, because
okay,
it's a book that I read originally in Spanish that is now being translated into English.
great.
And that is a book called, in Spanish, it is La Zarigüeña de Schrödinger. In
Uh-huh.
the English translation, it will be Playing Possum. And it is
Okay.
by the Spanish author Susana Monzó. And this
Okay.
is a book about how animals understand, perceive, and relate to death. Do they understand when another animal has died? Do they have rituals around death? And do they mourn the dead? And it's a wonderful case study of this particular perceptive capacity that, again, much like dreaming, I would say, has been in the past used to suggest that humans are inimical in some way, that it is something that only we do, only we
Yeah.
understand the finality of death, almost in this deep existential way.
Right.
But she shows that many animals have a very complicated understanding of the boundary between the living and the dead.
I remember reading an article about a death in a whale pod recently that was
Mm-hmm.
fascinating to me. That's great.
Yeah, she
And
has
I
a whole
what
chapter on grief in whales.
in Wales, yeah. I feel like there's been work done on elephants as well. That's totally fascinating. Okay, well, I'm going right back to 1872, and I'm going to pick the other Darwin book from 1872, which is The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, which is very like Descent of Man, but is, equally committed to this problem of what I've heard called, this is a topic I hope we get to, biosemiosis. So, in other words, thinking about animals as perhaps not possessing language, but nonetheless possessing signaling systems. And so that example I gave of the dog's snarl is not from Descent of Man, it's from Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. And again, I love, as a Victorianist, I love that you are helping us reactivate so much of the work of the late 19th century, which the behaviorist silent century perhaps obscured. So I hope that, beautiful and much beloved Darwin book comes back into common conversation. So, David, nothing is left for me but to thank you for this really terrific conversation. It's so kind of you to take the time.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And so the same thanks I will just say quickly go to those of you listening at home. And though there has never been a conversation quite like this one on Recall This Book before, if you enjoyed it, I think you should check out the Recall This Book archives, including especially episode 65 with Peter Godfrey Smith at our website, Recall This Book. So from all of us here, thanks for listening. Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.